This session is Switches Get Stitches, presented by Colin Cassidy, Robert Lee, and Eireann Leverett. And so thank you for coming out and attending. And one last thing, please remember to put your phones on silent or vibrate. Thank you.
We haven't done anything yet. Clearly a bunch of mustache fans. So this is Switches Get Stitches, episode 3. The first episode was at 44Con and was a training. The next episode was at Chaos Communication Congress, where I did the talk alone. But I like to do talks with other people, particularly these two gentlemen. They wanted to contribute both some more offensive techniques and some more defensive techniques. Have I just lost Mike? No, it's back. All right. So one of those questions that we have is what happens when a dual citizen anarcho hacker guy gets on stage and a developer from Scotland and a former Air Force cyber operations officer? And the answer is we have no idea, but you're about to find out. So without further ado, do we want to say who we are? No, let's skip that. Let's just get into the talk. Let's get into the talk. Okay, so that's the background of how we got here today. The previous talks of Switches Get Stitches. I'll cover some of the vulnerabilities from the previous talk quickly, and then we'll be covering some of the defensive techniques for those vulnerabilities, and also some brand new vulnerabilities just for this occasion, right? Go ahead. So this is one of the former vulnerabilities. This is a network switch. It's actually this one, in case anybody cares. It's protected against dust ingress. It's built for industrial environments, but it hasn't been checked for kind of OWASP top 10. So these vulnerabilities are fixed. Siemens was very good with this, but any hackers in the room identify any patterns in these session IDs? I should say HTTP as well, HTTPS. So these particular session IDs stood out to me and a colleague of mine, Reed Whiteman, because they are ascending, basically. They're in hex, and you can see the COA8, and that stood out to us as a pattern. So I've put up at the top of the screen how you would recreate the hashing of the password, which is not particularly brilliant. That's brute forceable. I wrote a little script to strip those off the wire and return the password very quickly. But more importantly, these session IDs, right? So if we can move on to the next screen, it should be pretty clear to you that the uptime of the device is the last half of the session ID. I discovered that by playing with SNMP and looking at the uptime of the device through SNMP. And then I wondered what this IP address, right? COA8 in hex. It suggested to me a 192 local address, but I got very confused because when I looked at the switch itself, the IP address did not correlate. And then I discovered it was the client-side IP address. So this is trivial for sidejacking a switch. This has now been fixed after version V5, and we can move on to the next slide.
So continuing a theme of session IDs, the OpenGear box, which is that one there, has set a small cookie with the tiniest session ID I've seen in a long time. It's 8 characters and it's all hexadecimal, and it just changes over. I didn't look at investigating sort of how the random number was generated. I just spotted they were really small and you could probably brute force it very quickly. However, this one is already fixed because in the configuration item you can use extended session IDs. It's just not on by default. Having talked to OpenGear about this, one of the reasons behind this was to essentially maintain backward compatibility. So it's easy for installers and operators basically to swap the hardware out and not have something else they need to test, something else they have to worry about. They can just drop it in place and it should just work. They're looking to turn this on by default in future revisions. And this gives us a really long session ID like the one at the bottom. So vulnerability found, immediately fixed just by looking at the documentation.
That's one of the things we want to do with this talk is capture the themes of vulnerabilities throughout these devices, that these kinds of vulnerabilities are a little bit endemic in these industrial Ethernet switches and in some of the other embedded devices that we see. So when we find a vulnerability and we check the next device and the next device, we find them again and again. And so that's why this is an important talk to give, even though you know, some of these vulnerabilities are getting fixed or just configuration options. One of the things we're really looking for is secure default configuration, so that when you give it to the engineer in the field, they don't have to read a 200-page manual and figure out how to deploy the device. They should really be able to deploy it securely pretty much out of the box, right? Okay, so if you go to my GitHub, you can get a script that I wrote. This is, you can do a couple of things with this. Essentially, from a vulnerability point of view, this is cross-site request forgery. But it happens to be, unauthenticated, obviously, but you can download the logs, and you can download the configuration of the device, and you can download the firmware, and you can upload the configuration file, and you can upload the firmware as well. Now, the configuration file also contains some proprietary hashed passwords. So if you have a previous configuration file, you can upload the password of your choosing, and then play around with the device, and then upload the old configuration file again when you're done, and no one really knows that you did it, right? Particularly concerning with firmware, this has been patched by Siemens. We have a bit of a story to tell you in terms of the timing of patches. And Siemens formed the middle of the field. We're very proud of them. They took 3 months to patch this stuff and did a great job of it. So if you're interested in using that proof of concept, you can just go on down to the GitHub. Switch mics. Okay. All right. I think you're up anyway.
So, continuing a theme, looking at the Siemens Scalance. About a year ago, Eireann came to me and says, "I'm looking at these switches. We found some issues." Speak into it. So I was looking at these switches and said, "Do you want to take a look at it further?" And so I said, "Yep, fine, I'll give it a go." Downloaded version 5.1 of the firmware, and we discovered that our favorite tool of choice here is binwalk. So we pulled it down, had a look at it. Basically, it's a large zip file. And opening up the zip file and taking a look at it again, the first 4 items there were rather interesting, them being the RSA private keys of the switch. And there they are. For people who collect private keys, I know Eireann is a real fan of collecting private keys. I just do it as a hobby. I'm sure there's other people out there who really, really like them. So we found these private keys. We had a bit of digging about to see what they were used for. They were actually used for the HTTPS traffic between the management planes. So as you plug yourself in and talk to the device and configure it and all the rest of it. These are the default private keys that are used to secure that session. So just by downloading the firmware, anyone could essentially man in the middle that process, which has the hilarious consequence of having deployed the device in the field. How do you upgrade the keys when somebody already has these keys to read your new key you're upgrading? But there we are. So we had a word with Siemens about this. It was a self-signed default key. They came back to us and said, yes, it can be changed via the web interface. However, there was absolutely no mention of this in the documentation whatsoever as something you should do. This ranks up there with sort of hard-coded passwords or default passwords that nobody tells you should change. So they eventually came back to us and said, here's a brand new version of the documentation, and it had a whole page on, you should change this, and this is how you change it, and you should plug in, and you should do it securely, which was very well done on their part.
So in one of the GE devices, I also found private keys. This is the GE Multilink 800, but it affected 7 out of 9 of the switches in that family. The private keys were used for an SSH server, which could not be enabled, and for the HTTPS server. In the case of the HTTPS communications, it was particularly egregious, in my opinion, because the passwords were in clear text underneath. So basically, if you had this private key in your collection and you could get a PCAP, then you could get the password and username that was enabled on the device and continue to manage it from there. This, they basically say to change this if you can, but there are no other encrypted channels in which to upload this key, right? This was the only one. So you could use Telnet or you could use HTTPS, and your HTTPS had a self-signed key there that was now compromised, right? Yeah, I'll say a little bit more about that later, but this is a good opportunity to talk about key management, right?
Yes.
One of our favorite phrases from this talk is the problem with key management is you have to actually manage your keys. This is a good example. The device that I was just talking about, the Garrettcom, or sorry, the GE Multilink, is actually manufactured by Garrettcom. And Garrettcom had the same sort of vulnerability with a different key. They'd put a different key in the firmware, and there it is. Now this is interesting to me because GE is buying a product and putting its brand on it, but they're inheriting a vulnerability from another vendor when they deploy this device. And in particular, initially, Garrettcom had said this was end of life for this brand of switch, and GE was unable to get a fix. And this led to a position where we didn't get any patches for the firmware for these devices for 8 months, right? Which is a particularly long period, especially when you consider in ICS environments, people can take a year, 2, 3 years to patch because you can't afford to bring the process down to replace your switches, right? And this is your network. This is carrying all your process data.
So one of the other switches we looked at was the GE MDS Wiyz. We don't actually have one of these. Essentially, we just went looking around and found the firmware for it and went digging. The things we found with this sort of highlight the problem of just looking at the firmware. What we thought were vulnerabilities were issues we can't actually test. And in discussion with GE, we eventually found out they weren't really issues, but they're interesting to discuss in a sort of a narrative sense. So this is the device itself. Again, we use Binwalker to break it down. We'll notice that essentially at the bottom there's 2 squash FS files. We can extract them out. And basically it's a Linux server underneath. There's a nice directory at the top called certs, which we'll get to in a minute. But what intrigued me was the .password file. It took me a bit of finding because I didn't use ls-a. I just sort of looked around and I went, oh, there's this password file. And looking into that, we found essentially undocumented users and hashes that weren't referred to. And they weren't particularly strong, and so a bit of Jack the Ripper, we could find out that admin exists with an admin password, guest exists with a guest password. This wasn't documented. There was an auth code user, which is used to reset the password if you've forgotten what it is, but you have to ring GE for that, and there's a factory backdoor, and I didn't break root, so if anyone's really interested, they can take a copy of this and go and break root for me. I got bored, what can I say? We then reported this to GE and said, we have this password file, you've got these undocumented credentials essentially, and they did some investigating and said, yeah, it's there, but they're not actually used, which leads me to a problem that I can't verify that. So if anyone has one of these devices they want to lend me or wants to verify for themselves, that would be ideal.
That goes even in the case where we have some of these devices, right? Because we'd like to see how different devices are configured in different scenarios. So the default state of the device when you upgrade the firmware or when you buy it is what we're interested in. And there may be some variation of these devices, right? So it took me a while to confirm that that HTTPS certificate was the same on every one of these devices because I didn't have multiple of them. So we're interested in your feedback in the future. This is also probably a great opportunity to talk about a tool called Little Black Box that I learned of from a gentleman called Jacob Kitchell. I don't know if he's here, but he does a lot of great ICS work, and he suggested to me looking at a Google Code project called Little Black Box. And essentially this is just a database of default coded keys, like private keys for SSH, for HTTPS, for other things. And I found it really useful after he told me about it. You download it. It's got something like 200 keys in it already. Those of us in the research community can contribute more keys. And we think of this as our little private key collection, right? You get on site. You see a device. It's in its default configuration state. All the engineers believe the traffic is encrypted. Whoops, it's not because I've got the default keys. So go and look that tool up and use it for your own penetration testing.
Before moving on, it's just worth noticing, I don't know if anyone's looked at all the users in that list, but this is an industrial network switch and there's a games user there. I'm still trying to work out what games are going to play, but we'll see. And for those collecting private keys, here's GE's MDS Wiyz. But in GE's defense, their original documentation says, this is there, change it. We didn't have to go and chase them up for that.
That's a good place to talk about how should we be generating default keys on devices.
Yep.
We do think it's sort of okay if a vendor says, here's the default key, but please change it. It's not as good as if they have a better way of doing it. The traditional argument against having non-default keys, keys that are specific per device, is that there's not enough entropy in these devices. And that is true. However, in deployment, I've never seen anyone just plug one in and not connect a laptop to it. And I do believe that a modern laptop is strong enough to generate enough entropy for key management for these switches. Also, a lot of these keys are self-signed. That's got some serious problems, right? You can't revoke a self-signed key. Not to mention, we also have the whole air gap debate. So should you even be calling out to the internet for certificate revocation lists in the first place? Well, if you're not, that means you have a certificate authority within your utility. And I don't know about you, but most of the engineers I know are already overworked. having them manage a certificate authority as well as doing everything else that they're doing seems to be a bit of a challenge. Now, if you are doing that, we'd love to speak to you and find out how effectively that's working out for you. And if you're not doing that, then are you connecting everything and managing keys over the internet? I think it's an interesting question, and it's one of the things we hope to promote you to discuss through this talk.
So, yeah.
There we go. Do we have more to say about that last slide, the one before? I thought you did.
No, I think you covered it with the self-sign keys.
Okay. So in the GE switch as well, we could have done this talk where we just talked about an individual vendor and went through all the vulnerabilities of that vendor, but what we wanted to show you is that you see the same types of vulnerabilities as you go from one vendor to another. So this is a cross-site scripting, and it's one of 8 that I found in this particular web server. It also affected Garrettcom because they had manufactured the web server. And essentially, you could make up a parameter in the HTTP request and put cross-site scripting in it. So you didn't even have to choose the right parameter. You could just make up a parameter and it would accept it. And there were 8 different calls through HTTP in which I could do that. I didn't go to the further step of writing an interesting proof of concept. That was enough for me. I wanted to move on to more binary and embedded analysis. So for example, one of the things I wanted to look at was firmware integrity. I've been trying to learn more about patching binaries and following up on the work of Mike Davis and Colin's shown me some new tricks about patching binaries. So this particular binary, I wanted to patch in a new key, right? I didn't have the password for that default SSH private key, and I thought to myself, why wait for the vendor to patch it? I can just patch the binary myself with a key that I know the password of, right? And to do that, I had to figure out what was going on. Down there at the bottom is an Adler32, and then you can see that there's another checksum being used down below. But there's a couple, I've looked at multiple versions of the firmware now, and a lot of them are zeroed out in the middle, and there's some variation of these numbers. So it is possible to create a malicious firmware and to bypass that. Really, even just with brute force, even if you haven't figured out what it is. So one of the other issues that we want to talk about with this GE multi-link switch and with the Garrettcom switch that bothered me was a DOS, right? Normally, if we were doing IT security, we'd think DOS, so what? Or maybe it's a buffer overflow that I need to figure out how to exploit. But I almost didn't put this in the talk. And then I thought about 2 things. One, this is a network device, and the DOS is not just for the web server, right? Essentially, if you DOS the web server of this device, the entire device reboots. So all traffic on this network will drop for 2 to 3 minutes while the device reboots from this DOS. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that pretty disturbing, right? Particularly when you're talking about a process control network. Imagine this was an H2S system and the alarms were polling across the network and there was some sort of a leak. Then during the time that you're DOSing the switch, you can't receive your safety messages telling you that there's an H2S leak. I'm also not particularly impressed with this approach, right? Essentially, there's a DOS in our web server, so turn off the web server. That is the response, essentially, that we're getting from GE with this particular device. Now, for those of you who don't have one, that means you have to manage this device using Telnet. And we all know that passwords in Telnet are in clear text. So I'm not impressed with this solution. So this is the other reason that we put this in the talk. I suspect that Marina and Jason are in the room today. If they're not, or if you haven't met them, please go and see their talk tomorrow. They wrote a great paper, right, with some other people about how you can use a denial of service to control certain types of processes. So a chemical process, you might add a reagent to a particular part of the process at a particular time. So if you wait for that moment, then you just DOS the switch and the control signal doesn't make it to where it needs to be at the right time and the process is altered slightly, right? Now, it's not my place to talk about how to make things blow up. You'll see that more in their talks. But after reading this paper, it occurred to me that I shouldn't just forget about the DOS. I shouldn't just let it go and not talk about it. So I decided to put it into the talk, right? Okay, I'll start with the first one. When I first started looking at the OpenGear, actually before we talk about that, let's talk about vendor response times, right? First of all, Siemens gave us some responses in about 3 months. GE took about 8 months. And I want to thank them for doing all the patching that they've done. If you don't mind giving the vendors a round of applause, I would appreciate that because I think they did a good job getting these things patched, right? But we do also particularly want to call out one vendor, OpenGear, because I sent them, granted an old day, right? So this wasn't my vulnerability, it was an SSH username enumeration, right? It's been around for a while, I tested their device, and they switched over to PAM and they mitigated it. But they did that in 1 week. I sent them a vulnerability report, it was encrypted, they replied to me encrypted, they told me before they had a patch how long they thought it would take for them to get the patch done, and they did it in 1 week. So again, I want a special round of applause for OpenGear for getting that fixed in 1 week. That's really a massive change for us in the ICS space. And maybe I'll let Colin speak about some of the rest of the OpenGear stuff. They also gave us this switch to play with, right? Can I just point that out? They gave us a switch to test. I think that's great.
So this is the switch in question that they let us borrow. There's the firmware and all the rest of it's available online. You can start messing about with it. It's got a development environment. It is essentially an open device. It allows you to build your own firmware for it. There's software that allows you to do that. On the offset, it's probably one of the better, or in fact probably the best out of the switches we've looked at, initial deployment we've seen. It was really hard to get, and in fact we got nothing pre-authenticated. All the vulnerabilities we found are essentially post-authentication, so you have to have access to the machine, which makes the issues we found, whilst potentially a high impact, really, really hard to do anything with at all. So the actual sort of real impact is low. The chances of getting anything done is really hard. So the first one we have is OpenGear have a support page, which you can go to on their website. Or sorry, on the sort of web server of the switch itself, and it contains a link that allows you to download the support information. The support information contains things like all its configuration, all the users, all the sort of IP config stuff, useful information, and there's a link that you can download it to. This page is only accessible by the admin, so the root admin can only see it. However, the URL itself is directly accessible outside of that user. So any user that is authenticated on the box can essentially pull down this information. And it contains things like what the cron tab is, init tab, the complete syslog, and the configuration, which includes things like the SSH key location, which becomes useful later on, IP tables, and other such useful things. So if you have access to this switch and you're allowed on this switch, it allows you to do sort of user enumeration or maybe dig about if you're a malicious sort of insider. The next issue they had, which we spotted, was essentially a get file that allows you to pull down any particular file that you're interested in, that you have permissions for. So in particular, we have their password file, which is much more sensible than GE's password file, let's be honest. There's no root, all the passwords are gone, essentially they're all in shadows, there's no game user, at least, much better initial deployment than the GE box. However, because we've just done the previous attack, we know where the SSH key is, and we can pull down OpenGear's default private key as well. Again, another one for your collection. But again, this attack is only allowed if you're already authenticated on the box, and you have permission to read these files on the device anyway. So it's a useful bypass if you don't have SSH access, but beyond that, there's not a lot you can do with this particular attack. We then started doing the sort of next sort of preliminary stuff. What you do with sort of web device or websites is you do cross-site scripting. And these guys initially thought about this. They have thought this through and they've come up with good protection. You can see we've tried to stick it in the system description and it's come back saying, no, you can't allow markup. And this is the same for all input fields. Input validation is strong in this device. They've really thought about it and nailed it down. However, being slightly sneaky, the device essentially allows you to have a config XML file that you can upload or modify on the box itself. So for this particular attack, I logged into the box and I put essentially cross-site scripting in the config XML and then went to the page itself and then got cross-site scripting. So input validation, really strong, locks it down. Output validation, just missing a trick there. And it's just this defense in depth thing that just needs to get nailed down. But again, you need to have access to the box. This isn't just something you can do pre-auth or really nail sort of as a remote attack. The last issue we found was cross-site request forgery. So this is the Burp Suite sort of capture of a new user account. And so having captured that, we saw it was a post, so we can turn this into a potential attack. So if we create a web page, it allows us to do a post. And then if we can get an admin who's logged in at the time to also log into your page, again, not the easiest thing to do, it will allow you to create that new user. So in this case, we can now see that I'm logged in as CSRF admin. So in summarizing, for this particular box, it's a strong default state compared to its peers. We can say that without a doubt. We found the issues in the Siemens box, like my first 30 minutes looking at switches in general, and GE boxes in particular. They've thought about and remediated some of these issues, cross-site scripting, input validation. I've not seen that on these other boxes. Whilst these issues do have sort of potentially high impact, being able to backdoor the device, realistically, it's a low likelihood of exploitation. You have to be somehow able to get the admin to be logged into the box and go to your malicious website at the same time. That's a real difficult timing issue to get sussed. Or you could be already on the network or something like that. These are all post-authentication issues that we found. We couldn't find anything pre-auth. And the last point I really want to make is, having talked to OpenGear about this, they've essentially been fixing these issues in developer sprint time, so 2-3 weeks, rather than vendor patch time, which is, what, 6 to 8 months. So in that regard, I think OpenGear really deserve a round of applause just for having really fast response time and a really fast patching time. I've not seen anything like it. So I think that's...
They've also been speaking to the press as well about some of these issues and how they're dealing with them. And one of the other things I like about their model that gives me an opportunity to speak about a couple other things while Colin sets up the demo is that because they're taking an open source approach to this, it solves one of the problems of big infrastructure, right? Which is, if I buy a device from these guys and the plant is operating for the next 30 years, are they still going to be in business when I need to change the security configuration because, you know, Mike Davis is pulling keys out of silicon or something, right? Like, things change, right? The state of security changes over 30 years and the attack surface changes. So you might need to change the device and the vendor no longer exists. So if it's open source, you can start to do that. And I think that's something we could be talking a little bit more about. You could be talking about code escrow with vendors who do proprietary work. And I think that would progress the way we purchase and deploy industrial system devices. Did you want to? Yeah. Are you all set?
You ready? Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Very good. So we're just going to demo the cross-site request forgery. So this is the HTML page we threw up. So we can see it's got a user of CSRF admin. It's got the really strong password of password, because that's what we want. And we specifically want to create him as admin. So taking a quick look. The device in question, we've got the users down the bottom that basically state we've got a root admin already. We've got a testing person and an admin person to begin with. So, and the admin person is logged in at the minute.
There we go.
So essentially loading out that page. It'll probably take a minute or two. Hopefully it'll work.
Pray to the demo gods. Sacrifice a calculator.
One time it doesn't work.
Nope. All right. You timed out. You timed out. It's a good opportunity for Robert to say a few things. Is anybody depressed yet about the state of ICS security? Because that's why I invited Robert along.
I'm the kumbaya guy. I get up here and say that defense is doable and talk about that. But one of the things I want to note about what they're doing is, a lot of people have asked us, leading up in the journalistic aspect of, so what? You know, what does this mean to us? What does this really impact in our community? And I think one of the important things to realize is we sort of have these defender narratives of what adversaries do, or when we think of how adversaries run their campaigns, we generally think from a defender mindset. The people that have actually done not just pen testing and exploit research, but actual, you know, network operations and offense and intelligence from the people that are the quote-unquote APT. You know, we don't hear from them in the community, so we have these defender narratives. And when you look at how operations are really run from targeting industrial control systems and critical infrastructure, it's not just one team, it's not just one person that goes through and does this. So you would have another team that generally gets you access to the facility, gets you to the place that this research is. So this isn't the breaking to the facility and find everything instead of the research. This is the once you're there, what do you do about it research. And from an intelligence agency or government standpoint of being able to own the network infrastructure, that is the goal in industrial control systems, to be able to understand what's going on. So there is no getting the O-day on the PLC or the IED or RTU. It doesn't matter about getting the 0-day on the controller. What it matters is owning the network so that you can learn the network if you want to do damage to it, or if you want to own the network to be able to steal the intellectual property or the process data and things like that. So what they're talking about is as simple as some of it may seem, just dragging and dropping the file here. This is the end goal. This is really what a lot of folks try to do the most damage in our environments. And so figuring out how to find that and monitor that and defend against that is critically important if we ever want to actually fight back against the advanced adversaries. So before I get into the defensive piece, I think you're good. All right, you exploited it. Good.
Yeah, we just exploited it. So logged back in, so we had a proper session, reran the script, and now we can see we've got a CSRF admin user that's in as admin. The password would be password. We could log in and use it that way. Now, again, it's a backdoor account that was created, but it's not hidden. So anyone keeping an eye on these things can find these things. Again, it's there, but it's hard for a real attacker to use.
It's a useful point or place to give a shout out to Reed Whiteman as well, who kind of joined us in Switches Get Stitches, not live on stage, but he wrote a blog post. And he wrote a blog post about another brand of switch that he was able to insert a backdoor account into unauthenticated without you being able to see that the account even exists. So not only can he create a backdoor account, he can hide it. So you can go and read that blog post as well and see that these are kind of general classes of vulnerabilities that you find in these devices. But since we've now depressed you with just how vulnerable the networks are, we wanted to give you some hope. So
sweet.
Over to
All right,
Robert.
so my turn. When we look at industrial control systems as a whole, especially for those of us outside the community, we think of this impossibly vulnerable, always sort of catastrophic thing, right? Taking down the nuclear facilities, OMG, we're all going to die kind of environment. And there's a little bit of truth to the vulnerable aspect of this. We are kind of depressed ourselves and how vulnerable and bad a lot of these development cycles were for the switches themselves. But we don't have to wait on someone else to fix it. And I think that's a theme all three of us have embodied is we want the vendors' help. You know, it's great when OpenGear comes back and says, not only are we not going to try to sue you for exploiting our switches, but here, have another one. Find these vulnerabilities. That's awesome, and as a research community, that's a great place to be in. But not everyone's like that, and we don't need the vendors. And I think that's one of the sound bites to come out of this, is we don't need anybody else to defend our environments. We need engineers, operators, OT security folks, whoever, to take a look at the network, to understand the environments that they're in, and monitor it for these occurrences. When we start seeing things like the firmware updates and all of that, I'll talk about some of the basic tools, the basic styles of identifying these things. And again, sort of looking from that attacker perspective, a lot of people love to build up the nation-state adversaries. OMG, the FSB, PLA, NSA, whoever you want to say, they are so powerful and so amazing, and they just have all the time in the day to focus on compromising little old me, that they'll always get in and defense will always fail. And I think it's sort of ironic that the defender community has somehow thought that the government has less PowerPoint and less management and less bureaucracy and less things to deal with. There are ways to defend against these attacks, and especially for those people that know their environments, that live inside the process, that deal with these infrastructures around the world, they know their environment far better than any attacker could. A significant portion of any attacker's campaign is trying to learn that environment, especially in critical infrastructure when you're trying to do damage or steal important information from those environments. So when we look at the ideal layout, right, for those of you that aren't from the ICS community, when we look at the ideal layout of a typical sort of generic ICS network, we're hoping for networks that are segmented out. We'd like to see you go in and there's multiple managed network switches to be able to pull data from. There's multiple points on the network to be able to pull off of the NIC and gather packet capture to look at what's going on. If there's a process A and a process B, we want to map those out to see how they look independent from each other. That's what we want to see. But from the vast majority of our experience and the community's experience walking into these facilities, it far more often looks very flat when you go into these networks. There are no way to actually understand what's going on in these environments, even for the people that have them, own them, and operate them. And that is what tends to depress me, is that our greatest strength in the community, the thing that gives us the most defensible territory, is the folks understanding their environment and noticing the abnormalities and the changes in it. Those process engineers, those architects, those OT or operations technology folks that know their environment can spot the advanced adversaries very quickly. It's not that complicated in truth. It can be hard with time management and processes and management or whatever we like to say. It's not an easy thing, but it's a doable thing.
How simple can it be?
So in terms of, yeah, all right. So in terms of the challenges in the environment, I did just want to throw this slide up to say, yes, there are challenges, legacy equipment, who owns the problem? Is it the union that owns the field level? Is it the, the company that owns certain infrastructure? Does the vendor have to be the ones that patch the systems? There are problems of ownership and management and regulations and everything else we deal with. So it's not a cop-out to say it's just simply easy. There are problems. But when we look at doing NSM or network security monitoring in ICS, and Chris Sistrunk's going to give a great presentation about it here on the 101 of how to actually pull this off, and we will be at the ICS Village and other places doing this and showing the vulnerabilities and teaching on it as well this week. But when we look at knowing the environment, I threw up on here before we even get to the vulnerabilities that we had. We've probably all heard in the community this past year about the nation-state adversaries coming, right? And instead of just the Stuxnet that everyone was referencing on the slides every single time, we get 2 new pieces of malware, Black Energy and Havox. Congratulations, guys. We get to move away from Stuxnet, which is great. But when we look at the environments that we're in, I infected a small network with Havox, this piece of malware that was one of the 3 sort of ICS targeting malware. And when you look at even just Wireshark data and pull up and just say, hey, what do I have on the network? We see a couple IP addresses and we see the ports that they're normally going to. And as sort of basic as that can be, it is the truth that in ICS environments, they're very static. We don't have people going to LinkedIn and Facebook, or at least they shouldn't. We don't have the environment of trying to check my latest Twitter feed to see if anybody hashtag thought leadered me or whatever, anything like that, right? We have static process environments, and we can map those out and understand them. And so when we look at like the post-Havox, for instance, the post-infection of this network, well, here's all these ports and protocols, and here's all these IP addresses that aren't normal in our environment. If I only use Modbus TCP or 502 inside my environment, there's no reason for me to see ISO TSAP and 102 and these different ports being accessed. And that should instantly be a red alarm for anybody in these environments. It can really be that simple.
You've captured some great stuff about the technology, but it's the people too, right? Like when I gave this talk before, one of the things I wanted to focus on was that engineers are literate people trained to look for anomalies. They look for anomalies all day long in the process. So security anomalies are another anomaly you can train them to do, and they're passionate about it, as long as they believe that there is a risk to the process, right?
So in a Black Hat or DEF CON kind of talk, to be able to sit up here and talk about capturing data off a switch probably seems like far too basic to get away with. But they've dropped 11 vulnerabilities in 5 different switch families, so now I feel privileged enough to be able to tell you that you should capture data off your network switches. I feel I've earned that right to be able to say that. That inside of ICS environments, for my ICS folks watching, not just your normal hacker, but the folks that are really out in the field on a day-to-day basis, there are ways to do it. And people, processes, and everything else can get in the way. But our limitation is not one of technology. It's not one of trying to wait for the vendor to patch. It's not one of trying to wait for the latest blinky box on my network to block the 0-day whatever attack. It's people and processes that we deal with to try to do defense and to try to make it doable. And we can do that by safely capturing network off these network infrastructures. It's not going to break your network to be able to mirror a port and capture data. Safely do it, test it in a lab environment, etc. But you can do it. And more importantly, just for those sort of tuning in, especially any sort of recorded video afterwards, my ICS brethren and sisters, right? The 101 may not be sexy, but it's what trips up those adversaries, right? I've been the nation-state script kiddie on the government side of the house doing operations. I can tell you that if you can find this kind of stuff, you can find anything. When you look at Stuxnet, Havox, Black Energy, whatever on the network, it stands out. The problem is people aren't looking. They're not using the simple, basic things we have to monitor these environments. One of the reporters asked us a very good question in sort of the press conference leading up to this, was how rapid is this? How rampant is this? How often inside of our ICS environments is this stuff occurring? And the truth is, no one really knows. We know what's going on, but no one's looking at the data. No one's looking at these networks, and that is the most depressing thing to me. It's not just the network switches that have vulnerabilities. It's the fact that we have really empowered researchers, really smart process folks, and we could do it, but we haven't been. As a quick example, if you look at like this Wireshark I/O data, for instance, of a small ICS network that got HAVX infected in it, if you didn't know the process beforehand, it's not going to stand out to you that this is HAVX infected, right? Okay, there's a nice little heartbeat up there on the pre-HAVX network that isn't there in the post-HAVX network. You can set alarming conditions, you can understand that environment, you can deal with that, but it's kind of hard. But what about the vulnerabilities that we've been talking about today, especially from like a firmware update? A firmware update, especially thinking from a government kind of standpoint, that's the one that bothers me the most. The person that can upload firmware to your environment and basically own the entire network infrastructure. That looks a little more obvious in simple I/O data of understanding your network. Right? It's really hard to miss that the giant box is something weird on the network. If you have computers that are on your network that are able to do firmware updates, they should be happening during downtimes. They should be happening in times other than the live network process. They should be happening from dedicated computers. If you can identify those giant jumps, you just click on the top of the plateau, find the IP address and the time that it was going, and off you are on your instant response way. There are ways for us as a community to not rely on other people to be able to do defense in our environments. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there's two things that I wanted to say about that. And one is, if you're an engineer and you're not a security professional, this is change control. This is change detection that you should be doing on your network anyway, right? Yeah, we'll just go with that.
So I guess sort of my one thought process is, especially the ICS community, please stop with the mythology. Stop with the defender narratives. The adversary simply isn't as sexy and awesome as we like to make him out to be.
I am not a nation state.
Yeah, not everybody has the mustache that he has, right? Like, we build up the adversaries to be a lot more powerful than they actually are, because that's what makes the headlines. The, hey, engineer X caught a piece of malware in the network and stopped it before it destroyed the process is not a sexy headline.
It should be.
It should be. OMG, Eireann is going after the power grid is what we'll see, right? There are narratives that simply don't exist. The BTC pipeline in Turkey in 2008. There has been Bloomberg stories about how this was a cyber attack, and yes, it was confirmed and Russia attacked the pipeline. Bull. That didn't happen. But we'll believe it in the community. We can prove that it didn't happen, but that's the narrative that gets captured in the media headlines, and we have to be able to move our community further than that. So realistically, we could do defense. And so from this, and our little clown noses up here, the thing that all this captures is sort of, well, security was done, we started doing the basics, and we all got to go home. There was no cyber 9/11, there was no cyber Pearl Harbor. Turns out we could just do defense, and now security researchers everywhere are unemployed. And I would love that. I would love to be like a lawyer or something instead, or a doctor, or anything else than a security researcher if everything was just fixed. And we can. We can actually go and approach that. So the kumbaya of my contribution to this talk is that we are the love children of information technology and operations technology. We actually can work together and find that process. We can take the IT security people and teach them not to kill the network. We can take the OT security people and have them actually care about what's going on with the latest in security. And we can do defense. And I'm all about breaking shit. I really am. I'm extremely thrilled about it. And 11 vulnerabilities in 5 switches families. One of them would have been a talk. The part that was the most frustrating was deleting slides this morning. Because I get to sit on the little email exchange of these guys, and they're talking about the latest vulnerabilities, and I'm thinking of YARA rules and bro signatures and things I can do to detect it. And there's nothing I can do to keep up with, because everything they look at, they break, which is great and sad all at the same time, that the only reason there weren't more O days was because they ran out of slides and PowerPoint. So we can do better, we should do better, and I just want to leave the community with that thought process. With no matter the O days or whatever that we think about, defense is doable, and we as a community can do that. The adversary isn't as sexy as we think they are. With that, I'll turn it back over to you guys. And
well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I have to admit, as much as I like to be the kumbaya guy, I am kind of ashamed. And I want to echo this, that I am ashamed of how we treat defense sometimes. I'm ashamed of how we respond to vulnerabilities, the discussion of suing researchers or preventing research or not just doing the basics with network security. It's really shameful when we start talking about critical infrastructure and people's lives and the things that matter the most. Not your uptime on the latest Amazon EC2 server, but people's lives around a hydroelectric dam. That stuff matters, and I don't need to take a switch onto a highway and hack it with a journalist to show you that that's the most important thing we can start thinking about.
We're ashamed, right? We're ashamed to, you know, find some of these vulnerabilities and have to seek press to make the point, to change some of these behaviors, to have to try and draw engineers in to this discussion. Takes a lot of work, right? And it shouldn't take that much work. But also, go ahead, next slide. We want you to be ashamed, right? Which might seem a little bit challenging, but there is a point to this. When we talk about SCADA and ICS and DCS systems of all types, embedded systems, I think is a better, wider term, we use the term legacy. And we use the term legacy to say that they are vulnerable and they are old and the technology is not built for this purpose. And that's not what the word legacy used to mean. You used to leave someone a legacy, and it meant something. It was a good thing that you left them a legacy. So what I'd like you to do is reclaim this term, right? What I want you to do is just take a moment to think about infrastructure. Global infrastructure and large organizations, large countries have given us amazing infrastructure throughout history, right? Do we want to leave our, you know, internet children with vulnerable industrial system devices? I personally say no, right? This conclusion was taken a little bit from a particular quote, which is, be ashamed to die until you have won some great victory for humanity. So I hope you'll take this home, right? Like, be ashamed until these devices and industrial system networks are monitored.
Yep.
You guys want to say anything about that? I don't want to just rant alone,
so
right?
I've cut you out for a little bit.
That's fine. So yeah, pretty much what they've said. These are legacy devices, but they should be a good legacy, not an embarrassment legacy.
So, that's it.
That's it.
I don't think I want to take any questions from these guys. Do you have any questions?
Yep, over there.
Okay.
Is there like a mic person running around, or do they just yell it out and I'll echo it? Just scream at me, it's usual.
Yeah,
Like,
we're used to that.
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Could you yell the last part? As one of the safety people. Oh. Yeah, I would say that GE has critical systems, but the question was about GE safety critical systems, and what I'll note before I'll turn it over to these guys about that is nothing that we found up here for any one of the vendors was unique of that vendor. And the point of that, of saying that, is the vulnerabilities that they found was across a multitude of vendors. This is not a one vendor problem. This is not the purpose of shaming GE or Siemens or anybody.
Not at all. We're really proud of them for getting these patches out.
Exactly.
Right?
This is an infrastructure community-wide issue. Any vulnerability that they looked for in any given switch family, they basically found, which is upsetting. So regarding the GE safety critical system, any comment?
Yeah, both Colin and I used to work at GE, and we're acutely aware of the fact that they have deployed safety critical systems. I'm sorry to disagree, but I do.
So the beautiful thing about this is there's beer afterwards and we can talk about it. But yeah, I would agree with them that there are locations, especially when we start talking about military applications, where GE is most certainly dealing with safety critical systems. But any other questions? Sir.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can imagine some of these devices forming networks for IoT as well. Some of those vulnerabilities will be similar or not, but yeah.
And then last one before he yells at me. Yes, sir.
Speaking of legacy and vulnerabilities that are plastic, any one should have any piracy icon on your desktop?
That's his desktop. No. MIRC is still cool. There's nothing wrong with MIRC. No, good to know.
I connect to trusted networks. It's fine.
Do what?
It was a
troll
question.
It was a troll question. Yeah,
and
it was. You have an
mistake.
MIRC icon on the laptop. That's yes. We're not perfect.
Thanks again for listening.
All right, thanks. Bye.